Thank you very much for this introduction and also for inviting me to Stanford. I'm really happy to be here. And yes, the main topic of this paper is really Sthiramati. And what I would like to do in the first 25 minutes, that is in the first part of my lecture, is to introduce very briefly the 17 works that are ascribed to him in various sources, and to show you how I understand the relations between these works and what I think about their authorship. So whether I really think that they were composed by Sthiramati and by one single author. So this will be the first part of my talk, and then in the second part I would like to focus on two of these works, namely on the commentary on the Mahayana Sutra Alankara and on the commentary on the Madhyanta Vibhaga, and to show how the authenticity of the Mahayana is proven in these texts. Yes, so the 17 works associated with the name Sthiramati do not only cover a very wide range of topics, as Paul already mentioned, ranging from commentaries on early Mahayana sutras, and these sutras are not on early Mahayana sutras that are not specifically Yogacara sutras. So ranging from this up to philosophical commentaries on philosophical commentaries and to Tantric works. So they not only cover a very wide range of topics, but they are also preserved in a great number of languages, namely in Sanskrit, Tibetan, Chinese, Uyghur, and even Mongolian. Thus, the reason that the name Sthiramati is not as well known as, for instance, Vasubandhu or Nagarjuna is not that the works he is said to have composed were of little importance for the development of Buddhist thought. The reason why Sthiramati's work has received far less attention from modern scholars than the scriptures of other Yogacara authors like Vasubandhu or Asanga. So the reason for this is probably to be found in the fact that Sthiramati was and is mainly perceived as a commentator and not as an original author in his own right in modern scholarship. However, as I have tried to show in a recently published paper, the classification of a text as a commentary does not necessarily imply that the text is less original or innovative than a work not belonging to the commentarial genre. Conversely, root texts, like for instance Vasubandhu's Panchaskandaka, are often likewise characterized by the restructuring and summarizing of known doctrines, rather than by the introduction of completely new concepts. Commentators like Sthiramati have shaped the doctrinal development of the Yogacara tradition by introducing new concepts and reorganizing previous teachings to a similar extent as independent authors like Vasubandhu. So privileging of independent texts over commentarial works in academia reflects, according to my perspective, our own presuppositions and is not justified. And it might seem that this is not entirely true, as in the Tibetan tradition, Sthiramati also appears to be less present than, for instance, Vasubandhu. But what I have noticed is, when reading Tibetan commentaries, what I have noticed is that the Tibetan commentators use Sthiramati extensively, so they quote him almost literally in their commentaries, but without explicitly naming him, so without honoring him as an author. So in contrast with modern scholarship, Tibetan scholars obviously valued the commentaries ascribed to Sthiramati highly. They only did not honor him as an author. Yeah, there has been a lot of discussion about the authorship of works attributed to Indian authors like Vasubandhu and Nagarjuna, and about the criteria for deciding whether two works have been composed by the same author or not. And also the authorship of these 17 works attributed to Sthiramati is disputed. According to my own view, if we want to achieve any progress in this area, in the area of finding criteria for common authorship, I think it is really necessary to compare the works under discussion in a more microscopic way than it was done before. This means that we have to compare their smallest components, like sentences, phrases, and words, and not only to compare some general ideas that they propagate. And at the same time, I also think that it is important to admit and to accept that in most cases we will simply never be able to know whether two texts were composed by the same person or not, and that it is more important to think about the contents of texts and its relations or its relation to the contents of other texts and the development of these contents, than to speculate about individuals and their personal development, like for instance about how an individual might have changed his mind in the course of his life, or that he might have been less mature when he composed one text, being like, for instance, 25, than when he composed another text, being 60. Of course, these are all potential possibilities, but they are so unverifiable that it makes little sense to base any serious theories on them. That I think that instead of emphasizing the genius or the importance of single authors, it might be better to speak of the relevance and the impact of certain texts on Buddhist thought. Yeah, and in the end, no matter who composed the works attributed to Sthiramati, most of them are important contributions to the history of Buddhist thought, and deserve more attention than they have reserved so far. Yeah, however, since the idea of Sthiramati as a single author of most of these works is so widely spread, I nevertheless focus on the question of authorship in my work and the question whether all these 17 works could have really been composed by the same individual. But my main project is to show that this is not very probable. Yes, so let's have a look at these works finally. 7 of these texts belong to the Tantric genre, and these are the 7. And it seems rather certain that these Tantric works have not been produced by Sthiramati, the philosopher. So this is an assumption that is accepted by all modern scholars, and I think there is no reason for doubting it. And these works are only preserved in Tibetan, and some of them belong to the Tibetan canon, but some don't. And this is from a collection in Paris. So the distinction between the Tantric and the philosophical Sthiramati is clear, but within the philosophical category, there are countless uncertainties with regard to the authorship. And the highest probability for a common authorship among all the philosophical texts can be assumed with regard to two commentaries, two Yogacara commentaries, namely the Panchaskandaka Vibhasha and the Trimshika commentary. Both commentaries are available in the Sanskrit original, and these are the 2 Sanskrit manuscripts. And as you see, the 2 manuscripts are very similar. They are written in almost the same script called Proto-Bengali, and they probably both originate from the late 12th century. And we don't have time to look at the similarities of these 2 commentaries in detail, so just very briefly, the main reason why I think that the same person composed both of them is that, firstly, Sthiramati is mentioned as the author of these texts in the Indian colophons and not only in Tibetan or Chinese sources, which mostly are legendary. So he's really mentioned in the Indian colophons. Then secondly, one of these 2 texts, namely the Trimshika commentary, mentions the other one explicitly. And finally, both works share a great amount of identical text. And when I say identical, I don't mean doctrinal similarities in the sense that similar concepts are mentioned or that there is a continuous line of thought between these texts, but I really mean parallels that are so obvious that it is almost certain that they were copied directly from the other text, so they are really identical. Yes, so we can distinguish at least two different Sthiramati's now, a Tantric one and the one who composed these two commentaries, and this one is in the focus of my research. And what I'm doing is to take these two texts, these two commentaries as a starting point and to compare the other works attributed to Sthiramati with them and try to determine whether they could have been composed by the same person or not. Yeah, another extremely interesting work ascribed to Sthiramati, which has the highest or the next highest probability of having been written by the same person as these two commentaries, is the Tattva-artha, which is a very long commentary on the Abhidharmakosa. And the manuscript of the Tattva-artha has also been discovered in this Tibetan collection, which is preserved in the Potala and available through the China Tibetology Research Center. But this manuscript hasn't been published yet. But there is one, this is one folio from the text. So until recently, we had only a very bad Tibetan translation of the text and some Chinese and Uyghur fragments of it, as well as a Mongolian translation of the Tibetan version. But now the Sanskrit has been discovered, as just mentioned. And one of the exciting aspects of this manuscript is that it seems to be one of the oldest manuscripts in the Tibetan collection, or at least the oldest manuscript we have seen so far. So it has been dated to the 8th or 9th century by Kasunobu Matsuda, based on its script, which is similar to the Gilgit Bamyan Sahib II. And this means that this manuscript is 300 to 400 years older than, for instance, the Panchaskandaka. And the exciting aspect of this is that at the same time, although the manuscript is so old, it has been translated into Tibetan much later, namely only in the 15th or 16th century. So this means that if it really arrived in Tibet in the 9th century, it was kept there for several centuries, maybe 600 centuries, without being translated, and we don't really know why. One of the reasons might have been the text difficulty and maybe also the unusual script. And it was translated, something, you don't see it, but something is happening on my screen. Doesn't react to my, oh yes, no. Yeah, so it was translated by the Tibetan grammarian Shalu Lotsawa Chikyong Zangpo. And the main Sanskrit manuscript which Chikyong Zangpo was using was in the possession of Gölotsawa Shunopel, but Shunopel himself had problems with his eyesight, and therefore he could not translate the Tattva-artha himself. And then finally Shalu Lotsawa did it. But as the Tibetan translators of this late period could not work with Indian panditas anymore, and maybe also because of this difficult script, and maybe also, so the manuscript is not in a very good state, so maybe it wasn't in a good state at that time already. For all these reasons, the Tibetan translation is full of mistakes and includes passages that are only transliterated and not translated. And this is an example for those of you who read Tibetan. So this is written in Tibetan letters, but it's still Sanskrit, or more or less Sanskrit and not Tibetan. And I have here, and this is an example for two mistakes that the Tibetan translator did. So he didn't recognize the uraga, but read it as raga, and translated it as duchak. And in the second example, he didn't recognize kasmat iti, but translated karma adi, le la sokpa. So the Japanese scholars who are editing the first chapter, so I think, or maybe, I first show you the relations between these manuscripts. So according to Matsuda sensei, the Tibetan translation is based on two Sanskrit manuscripts, and he calls them sub and main manuscript, and we only have the sub manuscript now, and the main is lost according to his assumption. And based on this Tibetan translation, the Mongolian translation was produced, and I haven't looked at it because I don't read Mongolian, but it would be extremely exciting to see what the Mongolian translators did with the really bad Tibetan translation, whether the Mongolian translation is maybe closer to the Sanskrit in the end, I don't know. So that's something that hasn't been investigated so far. And then there are fragments of a Chinese translation and another text that bears the same title, but obviously, as it happens very often with Shastras, is not a translation but only a Chinese summary of the text. Yes, and based on this, the Uyghur translation, of which we also only have fragments, was produced. So the commentary has 8 chapters, and the Chinese scholars who are editing the first chapter, so this is the only chapter that someone is working on so far. So the Japanese scholars who are editing this assume that the author of the text is identical to the author of the Panchaskandhaka Vibhasha, because the Tattva-artha contains, again, a number of passages which are identical to the Panchaskandhaka Vibhasha. So the situation is similar as with the Panchaskandhaka Vibhasha and the Trimshika commentary. So again, we have Sthiramati mentioned in the original Indian colophons and these identical passages. And the interesting, or another interesting aspect of this commentary is that, as you see here, there are only 8 chapters and not 9. So the 9th chapter, which is the refutation of the Pudgala of the person, is missing. And this is probably because it wasn't part of the Abhidharmakosa Bhashya at the time when Sthiramati wrote the commentary. So probably this chapter was added later. Yeah, then the next commentary attributed to Sthiramati is the Abhidharmasamuccaya Vyakya, which is a commentary on the Abhidharmasamuccaya. And actually the Vyakya is not an original commentary, most of you probably know this, but it is a compilation of the root text of the Abhidharmasamuccaya and another commentary, namely the Abhidharmasamuccaya Bhashya. And the problem of these two commentaries is that there have been a lot of discussion with regard to the authorship of these two texts in the Tibetan tradition and among modern scholars. And we don't have time to discuss the details of this discussion and confusion in the end. But for various reasons, the most probable scenario is that the Bhashya was composed by someone called Buddha Singha, and the Vyakya was compiled by Sthiramati. And the same Sthiramati is the one who composed the other commentaries. So Sthiramati definitely has not composed the Bhashya, and none of the traditional sources, neither the Tibetan nor the Chinese, mention him as the author of the Bhashya. But some modern scholars still have this idea. Yeah, and both commentaries, the Vyakya and the Bhashya, are preserved in Sanskrit, and the Vyakya has been discovered only recently among these manuscripts in the Tibetan collection, and is currently being edited by Xie Shuli, by a Chinese scholar. And it is very difficult to get access to these manuscripts, and since this is not really published yet, I don't have a photograph of it, but this is a photograph of the Bhashya. So I don't have a photograph of the Vyakya. But it's very exciting that we have it now because the Vyakya, because parts of the Abhidharmasamuccaya in the manuscript we had so far are damaged or lost. And now through the Vyakya we have access to these parts. Yeah, then very briefly a lost commentary attributed to Sthiramati, namely a commentary on Dignaga's Pramanasamuccaya. And the existence of such a text has been suggested recently by Matsuda sensei. And we don't know anything about this text apart from the fact that it is referred to in the Tattva Artha. And this is the reason why he thinks that such a commentary existed. And it is referred to in the Tattva Artha in the same way as Sthiramati refers to his Panchaskandaka commentary in the Trimshika. And this is a very unusual way of referring to a commentary. So he uses the term Opanibandha, and therefore Matsuda thinks that this is also a commentary by Sthiramati, that in both cases he is referring to his own commentaries. Yes, so we have Sanskrit manuscripts of almost all works belonging to this first group. And as for the other texts attributed to Sthiramati, only one of them is extant in Sanskrit, namely the Madhyanta Vibhaga Tika, written in the so-called Huktop Nevari script, which you see here. And I have investigated the relation between the Madhyanta Vibhaga Tika and the Trimshika Vijñapti Bhashya on the basis of a few passages in a forthcoming paper. And my impression is that this commentary has not been composed by the same person as this other group. And this is because the author explains identical teachings in a very different way. And in the Madhyanta Vibhaga commentary, and the author of the Madhyanta Vibhaga Tika frequently uses terms like anye, eke, and apara, others say, or some say, in order to introduce alternative interpretation of a concept. And in contrast, the other commentaries under discussion contain only few references to other views and only very rarely use specific terms to introduce them. So the Panchaskandaka Sthiramati never does this. He never introduces alternative views and doesn't use terms like anye, whereas in the Madhyanta Vibhaga Tika this is really common. He does it almost with regard to every concept he's explaining. So if the commentaries were composed by the same author, why did he not provide a comparable amount of alternative views in all his commentaries? And the interesting thing is that he also doesn't provide his own alternative views. So he presents very different explanations in the Madhyanta Vibhaga. So he presents 5 different explanations, but none of them is identical to his Panchaskandaka explanation, and this is strange. Yes, and in my comparison, I have also considered the Sutra Alankara Vritti Bhashya, a commentary on the Mahayana Sutra Alankara. And what I just said about the relation of the Trimshika and the Madhyanta Vibhaga Tika can also be said about the relation of the Sutra Alankara Vritti Bhashya to these two texts, to the Madhyanta Vibhaga and the other group. And what is more, the Sutra Alankara Vritti Bhashya is written in a very different style. So the person who produced the Panchaskandaka and Trimshika commentaries gives the impression of a well-educated and innovative scholar. He usually provides philosophically complex explanations of very high quality and not merely definitions of single terms. And in contrast, the author of this Mahayana Sutra Alankara commentary offers much shorter comments and is philosophically less independent or elaborate. Thus, in general, the author of the Sutra Alankara Vritti Bhashya appears as a diligent or dutiful, but as a less inspired commentator. And for all these reasons, I think that the Sutra Alankara Vritti Bhashya was composed by a different person. Yeah, then here you could you could see examples of how different the commentaries are. So this is from the Panchaskandaka, and the commentary is really long, whereas in this case, this is from the Mahayana Sutra Alankara, and the marked parts are from the root text, and here the commentary is much, much shorter. So he really only explains words and gives examples and synonyms. Yeah, the next is the Akshayamati Nirdesha Tika, and it has been ascribed to Sthiramati not in a traditional source, but by a modern scholar, namely by Jens Brovik. And it is available only in a Tibetan translation, and in the Tibetan colophon, not Sthiramati but Vasubandhu is mentioned as the author. But Brovik thinks, for various reasons, especially because some concepts are mentioned in this commentary that are too late for Sthiramati. So the text appears younger, not Sthiramati, for Vasubandhu, so the text appears younger than Vasubandhu, and therefore he thought the next stage is Sthiramati, and therefore it could have been composed by Sthiramati, and there are some parallels with the other commentaries. So, but no one has really investigated this so far, and I hope to do it in my next project. So we don't really know whether this could have really been composed by the same person. Yes, and then finally the Kashyapa Parivata Tika and the Dasheng Shangwan Shilun. The Kashyapa Parivata Tika is available only in its Tibetan and Chinese translations and is attributed to the author Sthiramati in its Tibetan colophon. And the commentary's obvious Yogacara perspective and its structural similarity with a section of the Yogacara Bhumi may be counted in favor of Sthiramati's authorship. However, there are substantial differences between the comments found in the Kashyapa Parivata Tika and the Madhyanta Vibhaga Tika, as has been recently shown by Jonathan Silk in an unpublished lecture. So both texts quote the Kashyapa Parivata, but they give completely different comments on these quotes. And therefore, Jonathan and also I think that this couldn't have been produced by the same author. And another thing is that the Kashyapa Parivata Tika was translated into Chinese rather early, too early for this other Sthiramati, and all this makes the scenario of a single Sthiramati as the common author of these texts doubtful. Yes, and finally this text that is only preserved in Chinese. This is a commentary on Nagarjuna's Mulla Madhyamaka Karikas, and to be honest, I very much doubt that this was composed by the same Sthiramati. And this text is available only in the Chinese translation and has been translated into Chinese rather late, namely only at the beginning of the 11th century. And no one has really studied this text so far, except so there is one Japanese scholar, Moro-san, who is working on this, but we don't even know whether this text is really written from the Yogacara perspective. So even this is doubtful. Yeah, so according to my impression, there might have been at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Sthiramatis, or at least 6 different individuals who composed these texts, and not a single author. So how much time? Do I still have 25 minutes? Yes, so in the remaining 25 minutes, I would like to focus on 2 of these commentaries, as I already said, on the commentary on the Mahayana Sutra Alankara and on the commentary on the Madhyanta Vibhaga, and on their explanations of a topic that I hope is of some interest to you, namely the proofs of the authenticity of the Mahayana. And in addition to these 2 texts, I will compare them, or I will also refer to a related explanation to be found in the Mahayana Sangraha. And we are going to start with the Mahayana Sutra Alankara, chapter 1, verses 4 to 13. And these verses have three aims, namely, firstly, to prove that the Mahayana scriptures were not produced by non-Buddhists, by the Tirthikas or by the logicians. Secondly, to show that the Mahayana is not superfluous in the sense that its benefits and fruits are already included in the Shravakayana. And thirdly, to show that one does not need to fear the Mahayana. So these are the official aims of these verses and their commentary. But if we read between the lines, we find not only arguments for the authenticity of the Mahayana, but also a great number of terms and concepts that, according to this text, define the Mahayana. And this is the exciting aspect of these passages. So the main argumentation of the first three verses is that the Dharma of the Mahayana is profound but hard to attain and difficult to conciliate, and this is compared to a king who is hard to please. But if one succeeds in conciliating it, it results in supreme gunas, in supreme qualities. And finally, it is explained that those who don't understand this Dharma are not able to appreciate it like those who don't understand the value of a jewel. Sthiramati provides at the end of his comments on these three verses a passage on what the Shravakas think are the unacceptable differences between the two vehicles. And he says that in general, the Shravakas think that the Mahayana is not the word of the Buddha because the characteristics of the Mahayana do not correspond to the characteristics of the word of the Buddha. And then he gives the differences between the two yanas according to the Shravakas. So he says that the Shravakas think, firstly, that in the sutras of the Shravakas, the skandhas, dhatus, and ayatanas are taught to be existent, whereas in the Mahayana, it is explained that all dharmas are empty or emptiness, are shunyata. Secondly, the Shravakas say that in the Shravakayana, it is taught that qualities, that the dharmas arise and cease, whereas in the Mahayana, it is taught that they do not arise and cease. And finally, in the Shravakayana, so this was the second argument, and then the third one is, in the Shravakayana, it is said that nirvana is attained when kleshas are given up by seeing and cultivation, by darshana and bhavana, whereas in the Mahayana, nirvana is attained naturally or spontaneously. So these are the first three characteristics of the Mahayana mentioned by Sthiramati. The next 7 verses, 7 to 13, are dedicated to proving that the Mahayana is an authentic Buddhist doctrine and that it was not invented by the non-Buddhists, and that all the superior results that can be achieved by means of the Mahayana cannot be attained by means of the Shravakayana. Thus, the focus is on the one hand on showing that it is not true that the Mahayana is to be excluded from the Buddhist Dharma, and on the other hand, that it is not already included in the traditional teachings and thus redundant. And the first of the 7 verses provides, so this is verse 7, and verse 7 provides 7 counter-arguments to objections against the authenticity of the Mahayana, obviously posed by the Shravakas. And because this is the most important or the most informative of all the verses, we will look at it in more detail. So these are the 7 key terms. So the first says that the Mahayana is authentic because it was not previously predicted. Then because they appeared together, because it is not the object, because it is established, because that would not exist if this was non-existent, because it is an antidote, and finally, because it is different from the sound. And according to Sthiramati, the first argument refers to the fact that if the Mahayana were indeed invented by someone in order to destroy the true Dharma, then the Buddha would have foreseen this and would have predicted it as he has predicted other dangers. And Sthiramati does not add much to our understanding of this argument. The only thing that I would like to draw your attention to is that he mentions the prajna paramita in this context. So he says that the Shravakas think that many dharmas, like the prajna paramita, were created after the Buddha's nirvana in order to destroy the dharma. And I mention this because it is very often the prajna paramita that is listed as a Mahayana sutra, also by Vasubandhu in the Bhashya, and no other Mahayana sutra is mentioned in this context. At the same time, the prajna paramita is not an important source for the remaining parts of the text, and many other Yogacara sutras are quoted later in the text. Thus, it appears that the prajna paramita sutra or sutras have the position of being the most substantial representative sutras of the Mahayana. I mean, they could have also mentioned a Yogacara sutra in this context, but they didn't. And interestingly, Yogacara concepts are not listed as representing Mahayana in this chapter of the text at all. And this is notable because the Mahayana Sangraha, which I will mention in a few minutes, presents the situation changes completely in the Mahayana Sangraha, because the text lists concepts like the alaya vijnana, the store consciousness, as representing Mahayana thought. So this was the first argument. Then the next argument, because they appeared together, simply means, according to Vasubandhu, that it is obvious that the Mahayana appeared at the same time as the Shravakayana. And why should one then doubt that it is not the word of the Buddha? Yes, and unfortunately, neither Vasubandhu nor Sthiramati explain why this is so obvious that they appeared at the same time. The next statement is that the Mahayana is not the object or the range of, as Vasubandhu adds, of the Tarkikas, the non-Buddhist logicians, or the Tirthikas. So Vasubandhu says that Mahayana could not have been invented by non-Buddhists because it does not appear in the scriptures of the non-Buddhists, and even if it is explained to them, they don't trust it, so it can't be their teaching. And Sthiramati explains in this context that the Tirthikas don't understand the deep and vast teachings of the. So this is Sthiramati's commentary. So the Tirthikas don't understand the deep and vast teachings of the bhumis and paramitas, of the stages and perfections, and that therefore understanding is not possible for them. And the bhumis and paramitas, as well as the non-arising and non-ceasing factors, are not explained in the scriptures of the Tirthikas at all. And even though the nature of non-existence, of abhava, is taught there, their way of dealing with it does not lead to faith. So in this passage we find a number of concepts which, according to Sthiramati, represent the Mahayana, namely the bhumis, the paramitas, the idea that dharmas neither arise nor cease, as well as the concept of non-existence. Then the next topic is siddhi, established. And according to Vasubandhu, this refers to the fact that even if the Mahayana was taught by another Buddha, it is established as Buddha word because a Buddha is the one who, having awakened, teaches in this way. So this is the only comment that we find on this argument. And then the next is that if the Mahayana was non-existent, the Shravakayana would not exist. And according to Vasubandhu, this is because without the Buddha vehicle, no Buddha could have arisen to teach the Shravakayana. So if the Mahayana was not the word of the Buddha, the Shravakayana couldn't be the word of the Buddha either, because no one would have become a Buddha without the Mahayana. Interestingly, Sthiramati mentions in this context that some Shravakas state that there is only one vehicle and not three, as those teaching the Mahayana claim. Namely, the Shravakayana, so there is only one vehicle, namely the Shravakayana, and that the individuals with sharp insight become a Buddha, those with middle faculties, a Pratyeka Buddhas, and those with a small potential, a Shravaka. And all this within this one yana of the Shravakas. And I don't know which concept this refers to, and of course this cannot be a real argument of a Shravaka, of a mainstream Buddhist, but still there must have been some background to the statement that you can become a Buddha within or without the Mahayana. Yeah, but nonetheless, both Vasubandhu and Sthiramati oppose this view and take the idea of leading to Buddhahood as being a characteristics of only the Mahayana. Yeah, and then not the last, but the next, because it is an antidote, refers according to Vasubandhu to the fact that the Mahayana is an antidote against kleshas, against contaminations, because it is the basis for nirvikalpa jnana, because it is the basis for the non-conceptual insight. So here obviously nirvikalpa jnana is introduced as another specific Mahayana category. Yeah, and the last argument mentioned in this verse is because it is different from the sound. And Sthiramati says in this regard that the Shravakas think that in the Buddha's teachings the skandhas are explained as existent, while in the Prajnaparamita it is explained that everything is non-existent, and that therefore the Mahayana is not the word of the Buddha. But according to Sthiramati, the meaning of these teachings is not identical to how the words sound. So it is not to be taken literally. However, neither Vasubandhu nor Sthiramati explain what the meaning is, what the literal meaning is, but from other explanations it is clear that the meaning of statements like everything is non-existent is that it is not completely non-existent. Yes, and what we certainly can conclude from this is that the teachings that things are non-existent is regarded as a typical Mahayana concept. So this was verse 7. Verse 9 of the Mahayana Sutra Lankara lists several reasons why the Shravakas cannot be, why the Shravakayana cannot be Mahayana Dharma. Namely, firstly, because it is imperfect, secondly, because it is contradictory, thirdly, because it has no means, and finally, because it does not teach in this way. And the comments on this verse give some additional information on the characteristics of the Mahayana. So the first part, being imperfect, means, according to Vasubandhu, so this is, this is verse 9. And the first argument, being imperfect, means that the Shravakas are taught only the means for their own liberation, but not the means for benefiting others. And he adds that benefit for oneself cannot become benefit for someone else just by being taught to someone else. The second reason, the being contradictory, also refers to the idea that by striving only for one's own liberation, one cannot attain highest awakening. And then having no means is similar, so the Shravakayana does not have the right means for attaining Buddhahood. And here Vasubandhu adds that without the means, so this is Vasubandhu's commentary, without the means, even if one strives for a very long time, one won't reach the result. And this is like trying to get milk from a horn, from a cow's horn. And in connection with this argument, Sthiramati mentions further concepts that characterize the Mahayana. So according to his comments, only the Mahayana offers the necessary means for attaining Buddhahood, namely Sherab Chenpo and Ningje Chenpo, Mahaprajna and Mahakaruna. And the first is then explained as understanding Buddha, Pudgala and Dharma-nairatmya, and the second is the intention to liberate all living beings. And then finally the last argument in verse 9, because it is not taught in this way, refers according to Vasubandhu to the fact that the Shravakayana does not teach in any way how a bodhisattva should proceed, so how the bodhisattva practice should look like. And Sthiramati adds that the teachings like the 10 stages or the paramitas are not taught in the Shravakayana at all. Yeah, then very quickly, verse number 10, which aims at showing that the Shravakayana is inferior to the Mahayana because of various reasons, which we mostly already discussed, like inferior intention, inferior practice, less time that it takes to reach the goal, and so on. And Sthiramati, in his comments on this verse, lists some Mahayana statements that the Shravakas think are in contradiction with the Buddha's word. So again, these are statements that, according to Sthiramati, are considered to be specific Mahayana teachings. So the first is all dharmas are without an essence. The second, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha do not exist. And finally, all dharmas are unarisen. Verse number 11 states that the Mahayana has its own sutras and its own Vinaya, and that it is not in contradiction with the true nature, with the Dharmata. And Vasubandhu explains that the Bodhisattvas have the conceptualized, the Vikalpa, as their kleshas, as their contaminations, and that these kleshas, consisting in the Vikalpa, are to be tamed by their own Vinaya, because only their own Vinaya is able to tame them. And this means that Vasubandhu considered this process of getting rid of Vikalpa, of the conceptualizing, of the process of conceptualizing, as being specific for the Mahayana. And Sthiramati adds in his comments that the kleshas of the Bodhisattva are concepts imagining, for instance, existence and non-existence, and that the Mahayana has an antidote for this, namely in the form of the Nirvikalpa Jnana. And then finally, this is the last verse I wanted to mention. So verse 13 is devoted to the greatness and profundity of the Mahayana. And the important term in the root text is avikalpana, non-conceptuality, which seems to be considered as a characteristic of the Mahayana. And in Vasubandhu's comments, moreover, the term prabhava, power, which is attained through the Mahayana, is mentioned. And Sthiramati adds several other terms in his comments. So he speaks of abhijñā, the supernatural knowledge of the balas, of the powers, of the mijikpa, of the fearlessnesses, and of the punya sambhara and jnana sambhara, the collection of merit and insight. And though most of these terms are of course not restricted to the Mahayana, what is meant here is that they are vaster and greater within the Mahayana. So in summary, the following concepts are mentioned as characterizing the Mahayana. So the first is the concept of the emptiness of all dharmas, then the idea that dharmas do not arise and do not cease, then that nirvana is attained naturally, then texts like the Prajna Paramita, then bhumis and paramitas, the concept of non-existence, nirvikalpa jnana. Then Mahayana provides the means for benefiting others and the means for attaining Buddhahood, Mahaprajna and Mahakaruna, then the concept of Pudgala and Dharma-nairatmya, And these three statements, all dharmas are without an essence, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha do not exist, and all dharmas are unarisen. Then another idea that Sthiramati ascribes to the Mahayana is the idea that the main klesha of the Bodhisattva is the Vikalpa, and then these various Buddha qualities, powers, and fearlessnesses. And we don't really have time for the details of the Mahayana Sangraha and the Madhyanta Vibhaga, and therefore I won't show you the text, but only the list of the concepts mentioned there. So the Mahayana Sangraha is exciting also because in its first chapter it mentions 10 topics which are not taught in the Shravakayana. And notably, some of these topics we already know from the Mahayana Sutra Alankara, but others are new and, as already mentioned, represent specific Yogacara concepts. So these are the 10 topics. So the first is the Alaya Vijnana, the store consciousness. Then the three Svabhavas, the imagined, dependent, and perfect Svabhava. Then the idea that everything is just a mental image. Then again, the perfections and the 10 Bodhisattva bhumis. Then the Samvara, the discipline of the Bodhisattvas. And number 7 are 2 samadhis, the Shuram Gama Samadhi and the Gagana Ganja Samadhi. So these 2 samadhis, according to this text, are not mentioned in Shravakayana texts. And the concept of Nirvikalpa Jnana, the Apratishtita Nirvana, the non-abiding Nirvana, and finally the 3 kayas, the 3 bodies, the essence body, the enjoyment body, and the emanation body. So according to this text, these are 10 topics which are specifically Mahayana and not mentioned in Shravakayana texts. And finally, I would like to show you very briefly how the Madhyanta Vibhaga and its tika by Sthiramati present the characteristics of the Mahayana in the text's 5th chapter. And the Madhyanta Vibhaga, so the structure of the text is as follows. So the Madhyanta Vibhaga speaks of 3 aspects of the Mahayana, namely its supremacy, its greatness, and its highest degree. And examples of the first, of the supremacy, are, for instance, the attainment of the 10 paramitas, or the attainment of the supreme object consisting in the Dharma Dhatu. And in his comments, Sthiramati says that the Mahayana consists in jnana, in insight, without all concept and without all vikalpa and prapancha, proliferation. And the object of this jnana is the tatata. And the fruit of the jnana is the apratishtita nirvana, the unfixed nirvana. So this is the first aspect. Then the Mahatva, the greatness of the Mahayana, is explained as the Mahayana's Ananta Sutras, and there again the Prajna Paramita is mentioned, and as the jnana of the Putgala and Dharma Nairatmya, so we had this before, and as the non-being fixed in samsara or nirvana. And finally, the highest degree of the Mahayana refers to meditative or to spiritual practice, like these 2. Or here only the Gagana Ganja Samadhi is mentioned, and Sthiramati adds that this and contemplations found in the Prajna Paramita Sutras represent the highest degree of the Mahayana, as well as the highest degree of the Nirvikalpa Jnana, and finally he also mentions the Adimukticharya Bhumi, which is a preparatory stage before the first first of the 10 bhumis. So the highest degree of the Mahayana consists in this Adimukticharya bhumi and the 10 bhumis. So again, just very quickly, a summary of the most important terms mentioned in the Madhyanta Vibhaga. So the Mahayana is represented by the paramitas and the dharmadhatu as its object, by benefiting others, the jnana without vikalpa and prapancha, the tatata, the apratishtita nirvana, the prajna paramita sutra, the putgala and dharma nairatmya, powers and fearlessnesses, the samadhi and the nirvikalpa jnana, and finally the path consisting in the Adimukticharya bhumi and the 10 bhumis. Yes, so I think now I have really used all of my time. So thank you for your attention.